The Book of Numbers, Chapter 33. These are the journeys of the children of Israel, when they went forth out of the land of Egypt by their host under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandment of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their goings out. They traveled from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the next day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with a high hand in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck among them. On their gods also the Lord executed judgments. The children of Israel traveled from Ramses and encamped in Succoth. They traveled from Succoth and encamped in Etham, which is in the edge of the wilderness. They traveled from Etham and turned back to Pihar-Hiroth, which is before Baal-Zephon, and they encamped before Migdol. They traveled from before Hahiroth and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness, and they went 3 days' journey into the wilderness of Etham and encamped at Marah. They traveled from Marah and came to Elam, and in Elam were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there. They traveled from Elam and encamped by the Red Sea. They traveled from the Red Sea and encamped in the wilderness of Sin. They traveled from the wilderness of Sin and encamped in Dophkah. They traveled from Dophkah and encamped in Alush. They traveled from Alush and encamped in Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. They traveled from Rephidim and encamped in the wilderness of Sinai. They traveled from the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in Kibroth-Hattaavah. They traveled from Kibroth-Hattaavah and encamped in Hazeroth. They traveled from Hazeroth and encamped in Rithmah. They traveled from Rithmah and encamped in Rimmon-Perez. They traveled from Rimmon-Perez and encamped in Libnah. They traveled from Libnah and encamped in Rissah. They traveled from Rissah and encamped in Kehelathah. They traveled from Kehelathah and encamped in Mount Shafir. They traveled from Mount Shafir and encamped in Haradah. They traveled from Haradah and encamped in Makaloth. They traveled from Makaloth and encamped in Tahath. They traveled from Tahath and encamped in Terah. They traveled from Terah and encamped in Mithkah. They traveled from Mithkah and encamped in Hashmonah. They traveled from Hashmonah and encamped in Moseroth. They traveled from Moseroth and encamped in Ben-Jaakan. They traveled from Ben-Jaakan and encamped in Hor-Hagadad. They traveled from Hor-Hagadad and encamped in Jotbathah. They traveled from Jotbathah and encamped in Abrona. They traveled from Abrona and encamped in Ezion-Geber. They traveled from Ezion-Geber and encamped in the wilderness of Sin, the same as Kadesh. They traveled from Kadesh and encamped in Mount Hor, in the edge of the land of Edom. Aaron the priest went up into Mount Hor at the commandment of the Lord and died there, in the 40th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 5th month, on the 1st day of the month. Aaron was 123 years old when he died in Mount Hor. The Canaanite, the king of Arad, who lived in the south in the land of Canaan, heard of the coming of the children of Israel. They traveled from Mount Hor and encamped in Zalmonah. They traveled from Zalmonah and encamped in Punon. They traveled from Punon and encamped in Oboth. They traveled from Oboth and encamped in Ayi-Abarim, in the border of Moab. They traveled from Ayim and encamped in Dibon-Gad. They traveled from Dibon-Gad and encamped in Almon-Diblathaim. They traveled from Almon-Diblathaim and encamped in the mountains of Abarim before Nebo. They traveled from the mountains of Abarim and encamped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. They encamped by the Jordan, from Beth-Jesimoth even to Abel-Shittim, in the plains of Moab. The Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, When you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their molten images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land and dwell there. For to you have I given the land to possess it. You shall inherit the land by lot, according to your families. To the more you shall give the more inheritance, and to the fewer you shall give the less inheritance. Wherever the lot falls to any man, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers shall you inherit. But if you will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then shall those who you let remain of them be as pricks in your eyes, and as thorns in your sides, and they shall vex you in the land in which you dwell. It shall happen that as I thought to do to them, so will I do to you.